Hello, it's Joseph Kemperman, your host from the Long John Podcast, coming at you with episode 3, titled NFL Free Agency Frenzy. So let's get into it. In the NFL, to start this off, I will say that the not-so-flashy deal can sometimes be the reason a team goes to the playoffs. And whether that's a not-so-flashy one-year deal, make-it deal, whether that's a whether that's a 3-year deal by a veteran that's, maybe middle of the class but solidifies and strengthens a position of need for a team. I think the flashy deals sometimes take precedent on the news. Of course, anyone doing now my job, any reporter, any podcast person, we all focus on those big deals, which is what I'm going to do today in this podcast. But I'm also going to focus on some deals that I really do think could make a big difference for NFL teams. And I'm not going to jump the gun, but let's get into it with topic number 1. Everything around this podcast today is going to focus on free agency. And I will say, please go and watch Michael Davis's Out of Pocket broadcast, episode 27 from the Tobacco Sports Radio. I was on it with my brother, the Camper Report, Benjamin Camperman, Michael Davis, a good friend of mine who also happens to be a Cowboys fan, which is not so fortunate for me. But we had a great time discussing our 3 favorite teams, free agency moves, Dallas Cowboys, San Francisco 49ers, and your host, Joseph Camperman's Philadelphia Eagles. It was a great podcast, so definitely go check it out. And let's start with topic number 1. So on Tuesday last week, the Eagles announced that they re-signed James Bradberry to a 3-year, $38 million deal with $20 million guaranteed. This deal can increase into upwards of $44 million with incentives. This honestly came as a shock to me. So obviously the podcasts are filmed on Monday night or Monday afternoon, as many of you guys are aware. And I will say that one thing to keep in mind is that when these release, so much news can happen in 24 hours, especially this time of year. So when I saw the signing of Bradberry, it honestly came as quite the shock. I thought, the number one priority was C.J. Gardner-Johnson, and I thought, bringing back some veterans. But all in all, they signed into a very, very team-friendly deal. I'm really excited about this because he's actually out of the top 10 in highest-paid corners. But I felt like he had a really good season last year. And so when he was signed, the writing was on the wall. Every Eagles fan expected for Darius Slay to be cut or for them to find a trade partner. And it was becoming more likely that he was going to get cut. So the moment that Bradberry signed the contract, Slay comes out and says, it's all nothing but love, Philadelphia. His wife comes out and says, no, she makes this Twitter post saying, no. And so every Eagles fan goes to bed on Wednesday night, the next day, thinking they aren't going to bring him back. And there was rumors that he was released. Well, apparently they partially released him, which gave every Eagles fan gray hairs. And they signed him on Wednesday night to an extension, which is 3 years now, technically a 2-year extension, $42 million contract with $23 million guaranteed. So really a very similar deal to the Bradberry contract. And all of a sudden, this ensures that the Eagles are returning their starting 3 cornerbacks, Maddox, Bradberry, and Slay from the previous year. That's a huge win for the team, a position that I had focused on in my previous podcasts, that I thought they were going to really focus on the draft and draft a cornerback. And that's where I thought that they were going. And I really thought that up until even after the Bradberry signing, because I thought, look, if Slay leaves, there's still a gaping hole at cornerback too. Well, now that doesn't look like it's such big of a hole. And I'd say if I were to do a mock draft right now, I really think the Eagles are probably going to go with some sort of a defensive lineman, in my opinion, whether that's an end or a defensive tackle. I know a lot of Eagles fans are going to be mad, but ultimately my thought is that's probably what they're going to go, even though we probably think that they may need something else, which I'm getting to in just a minute. So then after the signing of Slay and Bradberry, the Eagles announced that they signed Greedy Williams to a 1-year deal to compete for the 3rd outside cornerback spot, at least we think right now, on the team. Raising questions, like I said, whether they're going to even decide to go cornerback in the first round. I would say with those really essentially 3 signings over the period of a week, my thought is the Eagles are not going to invest in defensive back draft picks until third or fourth round. Well, we don't have a fourth round, so any third or sixth or seventh round. That's my guess. Now, it could be wrong, but that's my guess. So last night, unfortunately, every Eagles nightmare came true when it comes to the signing of Gardner Johnson. Gardner Johnson had a great year with the Eagles last year and ultimately really went down as one of the best. It wasn't an in-season trade, but after free agency, after the draft, really right before the season, it went down as really one of the best trades the Eagles have made. He came in and he really asserted his power and his safety dominance, something we really haven't seen since, I would argue, Brian Dawkins. I mean, Jenkins was a great safety for the Eagles, but I would argue that Bradbury may have actually been better and more impactful. And I know that's Malcolm Jenkins, was a Philadelphia favorite, and that may ruffle a lot of feathers. But personally, I think that he had a really good season, and I think a lot of Eagles fans would agree with me. So Johnson, when he signed the 1-year contract, I thought, okay, it's immediately he signed it with the Detroit Lions. And I thought to myself, wow, that's a shocker. He's definitely going for a prove-it deal. The Eagles couldn't have paid him as much as the Lions, right? Well, unfortunately, that's wrong. So it was announced that the Eagles initially offered him a 3-year backloaded contract worth $24 million. So ultimately $8 million a year, but I saw reports that $17 million was due in year 3. And that's a very typical Howie Roseman thing. More than likely, they would structure that to probably pay him over the period of years 4, 5, and 6 that he wasn't even on the team, is my guess. It's a pretty typical Howie Roseman thing. He likes to backload contracts, and he somehow gets out of them every year. Beats me. I'm not a general manager. But he didn't accept the deal because I think he ultimately, his agent told him you can get more. And honestly, I wouldn't blame him. You see the Jesse Bates safety signing and you see the Jordan Poyer safety signing, and ultimately he could have gotten more. There was a few other safeties that signed, and I really thought he was going to be in the wheelhouse of $12 million a year. Well, he signs for something with the Detroit Lions, a 1-year, $8 million deal. And every Eagles fan is left scratching their head going, how could the Eagles not match that? Well, here's the thing. After he didn't accept the $24 million deal they offered him at the start of free agency, which we didn't know they did, but after he didn't accept that, they went different ways. They extended Slay and they brought back James Bradbury. And so after they went their separate ways, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson's agent said, look, let's look for a different team. The safety market cooled down really heavily after the first signing of, after really the signing of Jordan Poyer and Jesse Bates. I really thought that, ultimately Gardner Johnson was coming back to the Eagles because it was quiet for days. And I think what happened is the agent probably overvalued the position in free agency and didn't take the deal with the Eagles. And honestly, would you rather a 1-year prove-it deal or would you rather a 3-year deal? And ultimately, I think the 1-year prove-it deal is probably going to pay off for him as a player. So I wish him nothing but the best, no hard feelings. But the part that makes me sick still is that the Eagles apparently had an opportunity to match the deal with Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, and they didn't. And this ultimately, I think, signals how much faith they have in their safety Reed Blankenship and how much faith they have in either signing a veteran like maybe a Josh Johnson III. He's hopped around between the Browns and the Rams, or how much faith they have potentially in the draft. And I just don't see them drafting a guy in the first round, but they could decide to use their late first round pick, their 30th pick, to draft a safety, maybe the safety out of Alabama, or they pick someone, like I said, in free agency. Well, they decided to go and they signed Justin Evans, who was an ex-Buccaneer. I think, honestly, he's one of those signings. He's a safety that probably is just going to compete in training camp and may not make the team. I'd be shocked if he does, but he may just be a depth signing. One thing that I thought of today, and this is a very out of the ordinary take that I haven't seen yet, and it may surface over the next coming weeks, is what are the chances that Greedy Williams actually plays slot? And I don't think so because of the way he's built, but if he plays slot, is there a chance that Avonte Maddox moves back to the free safety spot he initially played? That's a real possibility, and I think there's a chance that the Eagles could explore that. Another free agent that was just released, so he's now a free agent, is the Eagles' favorite legend, Jalen Mills, that signed with the Patriots after the Super Bowl. A lot of people really like Jalen Mills, whether he played well or not. He does play safety. He's a hybrid player. Is that a chance you bring him in on a 1-year deal? So there's definitely a lot of players out there that the Eagles could go for. And ultimately, it's going to be a very interesting couple of weeks and an interesting month and a half until the draft to determine what are the Eagles going to really go in the first 2 picks in the first round. Moving on Friday, the Eagles announced they had signed Marcus Mariota to a 1-year, $5 million deal, which can increase to $8 million with incentives. This honestly is a great move after the loss of Gardner Minshew to the Indianapolis Colts. I really think that the Colts, they got a steal in Gardner Minshew. I think he's a great backup quarterback, and he can come in and he can nurture their future quarterback that they get presumably in the draft. But the Eagles were left with a need at quarterback, and I think they really had interest in Jacoby Brissett, who signed with the Commanders, who we'll get to later. But they ultimately couldn't land him, and so in my opinion, they went really with the best free agent quarterback on the market for a backup position in Marcus Mariota. I'm not a huge Mariota fan, but the funny part is many years ago during the Chip Kelly era, his first year as coach, there was rumors that he was going to send, I believe, multiple first-round picks, Fletcher Cox, and other players to move up in the draft to select Mariota, and ultimately couldn't land it. And now it comes full circle, almost a decade later. I think it's about 7 years. Almost a decade later, the Eagles bring in Marcus Mariota to back up Jalen Hurts. And hopefully it doesn't come to the fact that he has to play games unless we're blowing out teams next year. But it's a good signing and provides depth at a position that definitely needed. So moving on to topic number 2, NFC East free agency news. So how I felt like I was going to structure this podcast was focus on the Eagles, then NFC East free agency, and moving along with the other divisions. So I'm going to highlight a few big names. If you want to check out more information on the signings, definitely go out to my weekly news report on Instagram. You can find it there. It's 7 or 8 slides of information for you guys to check out, which goes into a little bit more detail on the signings. I'm going to highlight some signings moving forward, whether I think they were good or bad. And we're just, it's not every signing a team's made, and I can't focus on that because that would just take way too long. So we're just going to go into it, starting with the Cowboys. The Cowboys re-signed safety Donovan Wilson and linebacker Leighton Vander Esch. Leighton Vander Esch has had quite a few injuries over the last couple of years, but the price that they signed him at was very, very reasonable, and I think was a good move. They also shocked the world and actually traded for someone, which I know a lot of Cowboys fans were raving about when they traded a 5th-round pick for Colts star cornerback Stephon Gilmore. That fills a major issue that they had at cornerback 2 opposite Trayvon Diggs. I asked Michael Davis on the show that I was on Out of Pocket podcast, and I asked him whether he thought that Gilmore could still play at a high level. He believes he can. I'm not sure if he can. I still think it's a much better of an upgrade, and for that price, you can't beat it. I think the Cowboys moved in the right direction. Moving on, they traded yesterday, a big trade for the Brandon Cooks from Houston Texans for a 2023 5th and a 2024 6th-round pick. This ultimately adds speed to a depleted wide receiver core when it comes to the Dallas Cowboys. I am going to analyze this on the last topic of the podcast, what I felt like with this trade. I have mixed feelings on this, so I will discuss that later on in the podcast. Moving on to the Commanders, they announced they signed Jacoby Brissett. Ultimately, like I said, the Eagles were interested in bringing him in to back up Jalen Hurts. Washington also brought in multiple O-line. Andrew Wiley, Nick Gates, Tyler Larson. They're going to compete for starting roles along that line, and that was a line that was completely decimated by injuries last year. So that was a really, really good move. I think those were good moves by the team. Whether they pan out remains to be seen. But it will be, I think it will definitely at least strengthen a position or provide depth at positions of need along the line. Moving on to the New York Giants. The New York Giants sent a 3rd-round pick to the Las Vegas Raiders in exchange for tight end Darren Waller. This was a real issue. I don't know if you guys remember last year, but last year the big idea was, do the Giants have enough weapons for Daniel Jones to actually excel as a quarterback? And they brought the Giants brought back Darius Slayton and Sterling Shepard. They also brought in Paris Campbell. So they've sort of kicked the tires with some more receivers. None of those receivers stand out on paper, but they did bring back familiarity. Many expect for Darren Waller to become sort of the safety blanket for Daniel Jones. I am not sure whether that's going to actually happen or not, but I will also discuss later on in this podcast my opinions on that signing. Moving on, the Giants also brought in linebacker Bobby Okereke to fill a much needed void at linebacker. And I would say that's a good move. The Giants defense was good in some areas, but definitely lacked position at the second level of the defense. And I think that he will definitely solidify an area that definitely was an issue last year. And I would give that one a good signing. I think that's a good move by the Giants. I'm still out on the Darren Waller trade. I think a lot of Giants fans were incredibly happy on that, but I'm going to focus on that on the last topic as well. Moving on to topic number 3, NFC free agency news. In the NFC North, the Bears have made some trades. Some signings. They signed the running back Dante Foreman from the Panthers, previously played last year, tight end Robert Tonyan. And one of the things that I will say that they did do is they brought in 2 running backs. So they lost David Montgomery, if you guys remember. They lost him. But they brought in running backs Travis Homer and running backs Dante Foreman. They also have running back Khalil Herbert. So that running back room all of a sudden looks relatively complete. And I don't see them drafting a running back in the first, well, let alone in the first round. Definitely not in the first round. But I really don't see them drafting a running back even in the second or third round because of the position filling there by those 2 signings plus the already running back they have on the roster. Moving on, the Lions, I would say a highlight for me with the Lions, they did decide to bring in David Montgomery. Remember, they lost Jamal Williams to the Saints, and so they now were stuck with, and they actually lost Craig Reynolds as well. Well, sorry, they re-signed Craig Reynolds. So they have Craig Reynolds right now, DeAndre Swift, and David Montgomery. I think this is a great move because DeAndre Swift was banged up constantly last year, which opened the door for Jamal Williams to have a really good season from a rushing touchdown perspective. He didn't do a whole lot on the ground, but he did have a very successful rushing touchdown season. And I think David Montgomery is going to be one of those guys that complement him with DeAndre Swift. My word, that is a great 1-2 punch. I think that's a really, really underrated signing. And I will say that I'm going to focus on the Lions later on in this podcast and what I think they did right. They also brought in some defensive back help, which was an area of concern in defensive backs, Cameron Sutton, C.J. Moore, and Will Harris. Definitely good moves on that front. The Packers didn't do much in the NFC North in the signing of Rudy Ford and kicker / punt returner Keyshawn Nixon. I'm not going to focus on anything else. The Packers are a hot mess of garbage right now. And we're going to move on to the Minnesota Vikings. That one of their big signings, their 2 big signings was cornerback Byron Murphy and defensive end Marcus Davenport. The Vikings defense was, to put it lightly, trash last year. It was absolutely trash. This was a major area of concern for the team, and I am a firm believer that if they don't fix it, you're going to see their coach potentially get let go next year. I think this is a team that's been on the verge of, everyone seems to think, Super Bowl every dang year for the last 5 years, and they are failed and ultimately to perform. Whether that's in the playoffs, whether that's in the regular season, I feel like they're always that team that's this is a real question. And I'm not going to travel too much off of it. I'm going to go too much off topic here, but my opinion, the Long John podcast opinion here, is that I don't think they're going to win more than 2 playoff games in a year if they currently have Kirk Cousins as their quarterback. And maybe it's a popular opinion now. He has not shown me in the last couple of years enough to tell me that he is any better of a quarterback than a guy like Derek Carr. And, it's a tough one. Do the Vikings continue to roll with him? My opinion is if they don't make it far in the playoffs this year, I think they go a different route next year. So moving on to the NFC South, before I move on to the NFC South, they did re-sign Alexander Mattison. And I will tell you this, keep an eye out for potential trade rumors that have already begun to surface for star running back Dalvin Cook. He's battled injuries over the last couple of years. He has played through them, but Alexander Mattison, when he's played, has shown some potential. And I could see the Vikings moving off of a big contract, trying to ship him for something like a 4th or a 5th round pick. And I think there are teams out there that could potentially be willing to take on that contract and maybe restructure to make it more team-friendly. Moving on to the NFC South, The Falcons, they re-signed some players, but like I said, I'm not going to focus on every signing. One of the players that they re-signed is offensive lineman Chris Lindstrom. That was a good move to try to solidify the offensive line position. Ultimately, what I will say is that the Atlanta Falcons knew that if they're going to bring in any quarterback, which they did sign Tyler Heineke, and I'm not sure if that signals whether they're going to go QB this year in the draft. I was talking with the Camper Report, my brother Benjamin Camperman. I am really curious whether or not Taylor Heineke is their answer this year, and if they decide to roll with Spencer Rattler and not Spencer Rattler, whether they decide to roll with the quarterback out of Cincinnati last year, the name is slipping me, or and Tyler Heineke, or if they're going to go out and they're going to sign a quarterback in the draft a quarterback with pick 9. I don't really know where they go because neither of those quarterbacks stand out to me on paper, but they could ultimately roll one more year and wait, but I just don't know how much patience they have for Arthur Smith. Moving on to the Panthers. They're going to be focused on later on in this podcast, so I'm not going to focus too much on them, but they have made some moves this year, whether that is coaching or players. They brought in QBs Andy Dalton after the departure of Sam Darnold. They brought in running backs Miles Sanders and tight end Hayden Hurst. And yesterday it was announced that they signed wide receiver Adam Thielen to a 3-year deal. I think all of these are great moves, setting up what we know is going to be a drafting of a quarterback in the first round, whether that's with pick 1, where they trade out of that, which I will discuss later on in the show. These are all great signings, and I think the Panthers fans should be really excited with the future of the franchise over the next 3 years if they make the correct signings and continue to move forward in that division. That division is so wide open. Yes, I think it's theirs to lose this year ultimately, which is crazy to think about a team that doesn't really have a quarterback on the team. Moving on to the New Orleans Saints. The New Orleans Saints re-signed Jameis Winston. This is a pretty good move. He's a great teammate. He's going to back up Derek Carr, and in the event of a Derek Carr injury, I think he could come in and fill in admirably. They also signed running back Jamal Williams. There is a lot of legal issues with the Alvin Kamara situation, and there's a real chance that he misses some games this year to suspension. If that happens, Jamal Williams will come in and I think will fill in admirably. I really actually like Jamal Williams. He's a great teammate, and regardless of whether he was only a touchdown-dependent machine last year, he still played well for the Lions, and he should be able to shoulder some of the burden if there are games, if Kamara gets suspended for games this year. Moving on to the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers really haven't signed too many people. I would say the big number one signing that the Buccaneers made over the last week is the signing of quarterback Baker Mayfield, who played for the Rams and the Rams and the Panthers last year. Ultimately, he sort of had a resurgence in his career towards the end of the season. He played really well filling in for a hurt Matthew Stafford last year for the Los Angeles Rams, sorry. And ultimately, I think that let's just put it this way. He's got a great offense, and that division, like I said, is very open. He's got Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, and then he's got Rachaad White. I mean, that's a great trio of offensive weapons. If you're a Buccaneers fan, I wouldn't be thrilled with the signing, but I'd also say, look at that division right now. You tell me one team that has actually stood out as a team that's going to win it. That division is so open. Baker Mayfield could be a playoff starting quarterback this coming year. And I would be bold enough to say that if the Panthers get a drafted rookie quarterback and he experiences some natural rookie quarterback growing pains, there's a real chance that the Buccaneers win this division. I'm going to focus on it a later episode, probably with a guest on what I believe will be the ultimate, well, not downfall, but the ultimate goal of whether the Buccaneers, they're in this odd limbo. Are they rebuilding? Can they find the future with Baker Mayfield? Is he a future quarterback? And that is a big question mark, which I will discuss later in a different show. They also re-signed linebacker Levante David and Chase Edmonds. Chase Edmonds is a bit weird of a signing because I feel like him and Rachaad White are somewhat same. Rachaad White maybe is not as good of a receiving back, so maybe that's the reason for that signing. But Lavonte David was a good re-signing. I was hoping the Eagles would actually make a play on Lavonte David, but that is no longer a possibility. Moving on to the final division in the NFC West, the Cardinals, starting with them, they signed Eagles linebacker Kyzir White. I was really sad to see Kyzir White go. He was actually one of my top priorities on bringing back after it was announced that TJ Edwards left on day one of free agency during the tampering period on Monday of last week. I was upset to see Edwards go because I was a huge Edwards fan. I was hoping we could at least somewhat keep that linebacker core intact and have Kyzir White come back, but ultimately he chose to follow Eagles defensive coordinator, now Arizona Cardinals head coach Jonathan Gannon, and he is now an Arizona Cardinal. Moving on, the 49ers signed QB Sam Darnold. I actually think this is a very interesting one. I discussed this also in detail with the Camper Report and Michael Davis in the Out of Pocket podcast on that aired on Friday. Check it out on the Tobacco Road Radio Sports broadcast on YouTube. I discussed this, whether this was a good signing. I really actually think this was a great signing because ultimately Sam Darnold is a good teammate. He's not going to put pressure on their quarterbacks to have to perform good. So you now have got this situation between the quarterback that they currently have on the roster in Brock Purdy, the quarterback that they drafted, and the name is completely slipping me, and I apologize, guys, but I'm going to look it up right here for you. 49ers drafted. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank. The 49ers drafted QB in Trey Lance. There you go. I don't know why. I had Trey, but I couldn't think of his last name. And so they've got Trey and Brock Purdy on the roster, and they bring in Sam Darnold. I want to focus on this for just a moment because I really think that this is actually a good signing. Trey Lance is not going to feel the pressure to compete. He'll feel the pressure to compete, but he won't feel like this overarching shadow. You got to remember, whether 49ers fans like it or not, Jimmy Garoppolo was that overarching shadow that's like, hey, Trey, you slip up, bro. You've got a guy who took them to the Super Bowl, whether it was with a good defense and a good supporting cast, he still has experience. Whereas Sam Darnold's one of those guys who's really going to have to blow people away in training camp because otherwise he is pretty much being brought in there as a backup to Trey Lance until Brock Purdy gets healthy. And once Brock Purdy's healthy, there's a real chance that Sam Darnold's let go. And so this is a very interesting situation, but I think it'll end up turning out to be good. I am going to come out and say this. My bold take is the 49ers signing of edge Clelin Ferrell may be one of the best signings in free agency. And here's the reason why. That is a defense that is going to thrive. Under Steve Wilks, new defensive coordinator, he is going to do wonders with that team, in my opinion. And that defensive line has Javon Hargrave, Nick Bosa, Eric Armstead, and now Clelin Ferrell. You know, Clelin Ferrell, I could see how very much of it's like a Samson Ebukam type season where it's like, you're not getting the double teams, you're getting the single teams because of the double teams by Nick Bosa. And, I think it's a good move. It's not really a flashy move, but I think it could be one of those moves that I talked about in free agency in the beginning of the show that's not flashy, but could end up really paying off. They also re-signed Tashaun Gibson, the safety, and center Jake Brendel, both good signings. So I think the 49ers have definitely made some positive signings this year. Moving on, the Seahawks signed linebacker Devin Bush, safety Julian Love, and defensive line Jerron Reed. The Seahawks are an odd one. They have first round pick. A lot of people are questioning whether they could still potentially go with the number one and go with maybe the third or fourth quarterback in the draft, depending on where things fall. My argument would probably be they don't, and they go with a defensive lineman prospect, whether that is Jalen Carter, who is now slipping, he's now falling down draft boards. My thought would be if Will Anderson is still available. I highly doubt that. My thought is he goes to Cardinals at pick 3. But if Will Anderson is available, does Will Anderson get drafted by the Seahawks, or do they go with another different defensive player? My thought is Seahawks are going defense next year, but I could be wrong. And that, that's going to be an interesting situation to monitor. Moving on to topic number 4, AFC free agency news. So this is going to be a lot to unpack because there have been some pretty big moves, including some today, which I will discuss. So in the AFC East, the Bills decided, you know what, we're going to go out and we're going to strengthen our offensive line, and we're going to sign offensive guard Connor McGovern. They also went out and they signed Dane Jackson. The biggest news today, that, in my opinion, was the signing of Damian Harris. So they lost Devin Singletary and they decided to bring in Damian Harris. This is an issue of real need for the Bills. I think the issue with the Bills, and this is one of my big issues with them, is Josh Allen can't be your running back. You need to minimize the amount of running that Josh Allen does and actually have a dang ground attack. I really think that's one of the reasons why they didn't go far in the playoffs. You know, the interesting statistic is if you look at the last, I think it was 3 Super Bowl winners in the Buccaneers, the Chiefs, and the Rams, and that was in no particular order. None of these guys had good rushing attacks, so it's interesting to see whether that opinion is actually valid of mine. But I will say this. Throughout the season, one of their issues was they could not run the ball well. They were not good at running the ball. And Devin Singletary is one of those great, like, pass-catching type of backs. Ultimately, the weird part about all of this is they lose Devin Singletary, obviously. He's not signing with anyone. Now the question is, you know, and I believe Devin Singletary is one of those situations where, you know, does he make an impact for the Houston Texans who just signed him? Remains to be seen, but the Bills see the need of running back, and they go out and they sign Damian Harris. So they've got Damian Harris, they've got James Cook. The real question is this going to improve enough, or do they still draft someone? I could see the Bills drafting a guy like Jahmyr Gibbs from Alabama because they've got a late first-round pick. You could even see them maybe make a play at Bijan Robinson. I would say that would actually be a really good move. They need to have a running back that they can rely on for 20-plus carries a game, because unless James Cook does something that I have not seen, he's not their starting running back, whether they want to admit it or not. But Damian Harris could actually play really well under that system, so it remains to be seen whether that's a good signing. The Dolphins decide to bring back both running backs to maintain to really maintain the gel that's going on in the locker room. They've brought back Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson. Both of those guys are going to bring familiarity back to that team. And they also went out and they signed Mike White to back up, presumably Tua. So I'm not really putting much stock into that. But jumping back, the Bills did sign safety Jordan Poyer, which I discussed earlier on in the show, so I'm not going to go into much detail. That was a good signing. Jordan Poyer has been a great player for that team. Okay, skipping ahead to the Patriots, they signed running back James Robinson. This is a really good move because obviously it replaces Damian Harris, and I really think James Robinson will be a really good running back in that system. You know, Bill Belichick is pretty obsessed with having multiple running backs play roles on that team, so don't be surprised if ultimately James Robinson doesn't do much, but I think he has a role on that team, and I think it'll be a good role. One of the big things that the Patriots did, and I think it's underrated and should be focused on more, is they did sign wide receiver Juju Smith-Schuster. Smith-Schuster excels in the slot, and those quick passes is what that offense is predicated on. I expect Juju Smith-Schuster to potentially become an 1,000-yard receiver for the Patriots, and I think this is a good move, especially if they're committed to keeping their quarterback. Which I would think that they are right now keeping the quarterback, but it remains to be seen whether Matt Jones is going to continue to stay with them. I would think yes, for right now, yes, unless they shock the world and do something crazy. In addition, they also signed Mike Gesicki. Unfortunately, from a fantasy football perspective, I don't think this does much for them, but tight end Mike Gesicki will probably come in and very well could have a third down role for this team. He's a good tight end, but I think he really ends up in a situation that's not the greatest. Moving on to the Jets, this is a really interesting one, and I'm going to focus on this a little bit longer than I typically would. The Jets are really in limbo right now, so it's interesting because they re-signed defensive linemen Solomon Thomas and Quincy Williams. Both of those are good signings, but they've got this list that the Green Bay Packers are apparently, or that Aaron Rodgers is apparently giving them, that he wants them to sign in order to go there. Now, I don't know how much of this is a smokescreen. I will say that list included players like Randall Cobb, Allen Lazard and their tight end um, that didn't caught 6 passes for 66 yards last year. And their tight end, Mercedes Lewis, he's not even a good tight end anymore. And I hope this report's wrong, and I don't think it is. But the Jets decide to go out and sign Allen Lazard. This puts E.J. Moore pretty much in the doghouse now because you've got Garrett Wilson and Allen Lazard. That's a good wide receiver duo. I have no problem with that signing, but I have a problem if they go out and they get a guy like Randall Cobb, who in my opinion is washed up, and a guy like Mercedes Lewis. Like, if those are your guys you're literally just catering to a quarterback for what? To win maybe one season. You don't even know if you're going to be able to commit to him for more than one season because he may retire. He may not commit to you. So I don't like the Jets. It's tough because I think that those are 3 good signings in the Lazard, Thomas, and Williams signing. But where are the Jets going from here? They've got a defensive-minded coach who's wanting that quarterback. And now it's like, is this a good signing? Who knows? Remains to be seen. Moving on to the AFC North, the Ravens. I'm going to focus on them later on with the last topic, next topic. They signed Justice Hill. Whoop-de-doo. Great signing. Moving on to the Bengals. They signed offensive tackle Orlando Brown. This was a phenomenal signing. Look, the bottom line is the Bengals are prioritizing protecting their star quarterback in Joey Burrow. I think that Joe Burrow is a phenomenal quarterback, but as we saw with Patrick Mahomes, when you don't have an O-line in the Super Bowl, hence the Buccaneers defense was able to just run rampant. And that happened similar in the Super Bowl last year where Joe Burrow was under crazy amount of pressure throughout the playoffs, really, and allowed, I think, 7+ sacks in one of the games. They still made it to the Super Bowl, but that was one of the reasons why they didn't really win it, in my opinion. And I think everyone shares that common opinion. So they go out and they get Orlando Brown, the best left tackle in free agency, to a relatively cheap deal with $16 million per year. He plays left tackle. Now, unfortunately, Jonah Williams, their left tackle, has now requested a trade, understandably so. Unless they can somehow convince Jonah Williams to stay, I would say they're going to ship him for something like a 3rd-round pick. He was a 1st-round pick a couple years ago. It's an interesting situation that they didn't decide to keep him. I think they wanted more out of their offensive line, and they go and they get a guy like Orlando Brown who's going to fill in admirably and is going to do a good job for that team. In addition, they also brought in offensive guard Cody Ford. This just solidifies a position and a line that was also decimated by injuries throughout the season, especially in the playoffs. Moving on to the Cleveland Browns. The Cleveland Browns signed Ogbo Okoronkwo. He's an edge. I would say, they also signed Dalvin Tomlinson. He's a defensive lineman. It's Juan Thornhill. And they re-signed Sion Takitaki. Here's my opinion on the Cleveland Browns, and this is an interesting one. I don't focus as much on AFC just because I'm an NFC fan of the Philadelphia Eagles who are in the NFC, and I don't focus on the AFC as much. But for this purpose in this podcast, I will say this. The Cleveland Browns is an interesting situation because their success, as in a lot of teams' success, is directly tied to the success of Deshaun Watson. He misses 10 games last year. I thought he should have missed the whole year, and I'll stand by that till the day I die. But Deshaun Watson has a really interesting situation because if he performs well, this team is potentially one of the best teams in that division. I'd say they definitely are willing there would compete with the Bengals. If he doesn't perform well, they spend all this guaranteed money, and it's ultimately going to cap them on what they can do. So, very interesting on that front. Moving on to the Pittsburgh Steelers. They signed offensive guard Isaac Seumalo, played offensive guard for the Eagles last year, was probably one of the best offensive guards in free agency. The Steelers went out and they signed actually another ex-Eagle who was for the Jets last year, but Nate Herbig, he's a guard as well. That ultimately strengthens that line for Kenny Pickett. I think the Steelers are all in on their quarterback. They also signed Patrick Peterson, and I'm not really too fond of that signing. I just don't think Patrick Peterson has a whole lot left in the tank. So, that remains to be seen whether that's going to do much. But the signings of Seumalo especially, it's going to really solidify the line. And Seumalo is very good because he can play left guard, he can play right guard, he can play center. He's played left guard for the Eagles until they drafted Landon Dickerson, and then he moved to right guard, but he was initially drafted as a center to presumably take over for Jason Kelce, which Jason Kelce ended up playing and a lot longer than I think a lot of people, well, not a lot longer, but ended up playing for the Eagles maybe longer than initially thought. So, yeah, good. I'm very happy as an Eagles fan. There's no complaints there. I'm sad to see Samuel go, but like I said in the last episode, which if you haven't watched it is still super pertinent. All the information in that last episode, episode 2. I discussed how Cam Jurgens would ultimately be filling the void left by Samuel, and I think he'll do a good job for the Eagles. Moving on to the AFC South, the Texans signed QB Case Keenum, wide receiver Noah Brown, and Robert Woods. I would say those two wide receivers will help ease the pain of the departure caused by Brandon Cooks. Ultimately, I could very much see them go with one of the top receivers in the draft with that later 12th pick in the draft. If they don't use that to package to move up in the draft, which I'll discuss in the next topic. They also signed safety Jimmy Ward, which I'm not surprised because he's familiar with DeMeco Ryans for the defensive coordinator, now head coach for the Houston Texans, but he was the defensive coordinator for the 49ers last year. Jimmy Ward playing for the 49ers is very similar, very familiar with DeMeco Ryans and the way he plays defense. So that'll be a good signing in my opinion. And Jimmy is very flexible. He can play a hybrid cornerback role as well. So that will bode well for the Texans. They also signed running back Devin Singletary. This is really odd. The Texans are such a team there's so many parts that they need that all of these signings could end up playing out really well, or they could just be bad, and then you have a team that's struggling with I could very well see a path that the Houston Texans still have a top 5 pick next year, just because I don't think they have enough pieces this year to get it right. But I think with DeMeco Ryans, they're moving in the right direction. Moving on, the Colts have not done a whole lot. I think they're going to focus, a lot in the draft. A lot of it depends on, what they're able to do in the draft, whether they're able to get the quarterback they want or whether they'll have to move up to get the quarterback they want in the draft. They did sign Edge Samson Ebukam. This continues a line of players that have signed from the defensive line, from the 49ers, and gone to sign for the, what was assigned for the Indianapolis Colts. Years ago, you had the defensive lineman that I'm now trying to think of that I can't think of that signed from defensive lineman for the 49ers. He now signs. Now you've got Samson Ebukam signing with the Colts. But that's just a little nerdy fact of the day. Those are 2 players that have signed from the 49ers over to the Colts. They also made Matt Gay, the kicker, the highest paid kicker in the NFL. This is typical free agency for you, where a team overpays a player. I think Matt Gay is a great kicker, but also you're telling me he's making more money than Justin Tucker? I'm not sure if I agree with that signing. Moving on to the Jaguars. I know we're getting into this, but I want to give you guys as much of a analysis as possible for any of you guys who are interested in this type of period because it's very interesting. There's a lot of information to unpack. The Jaguars have also been relatively quiet. They did re-sign safety Andrew Wingard. They also signed cornerbacks Trey Herndon and defensive lineman Rory Robertson Harris. The Jaguars are an interesting team because they did really well last year, and I think the more that Trevor Lawrence grows, the better this team will be, which is obvious. But I think under Doug Peterson, Trevor Lawrence's sky is the limit. And I'm excited to see what the Jaguars do the remainder of free agency into the draft and how they improve that team. The Titans went out ultimately and signed a replacement for the left tackle they lost in free agency, who's still not signed anywhere but is not re-signing with the team. They went out and they signed left tackle Andrew Dillard, and offensive guard Daniel Brunskill. Dillard played for the Eagles and was a good left tackle when filling in for Jordan Mailata. He wasn't Mailata's level, but he'll grow into that left tackle position because he's not played a whole lot, and I think that's actually going to be a really good pick for the Titans. A team that could very well find themselves at the bottom of the division. So that'll be interesting to see what happens with that. They have a lot of decisions to make. Moving on to the final division, the AFC West, I'm going to go really quickly through this division because there wasn't a whole lot of signings that I want to discuss because I did discuss a lot of the signings last week. The Broncos did bring in backup quarterback Jarrett Stidham to back up Russell Wilson. They also brought in Samaje Perine. That's a really, really good signing, and I think is not going to be focused on very much by the media because ultimately Perine has an opportunity to really fill in well for the Broncos until their running back comes back from injury. And I think that he will actually have a real carved out role due to the fact that new coach Sean Payton loves to throw to running backs, and so I think that'll be an interesting player to keep an eye out for. Moving on to the Chiefs. The Chiefs, they made some interesting signings. They brought in safety Mike Edwards. They signed Tershawn Wharton and who's a defensive end, and offensive guard Nick Allegretti. My guess would be they also signed, obviously, Juwan Taylor, like many of you guys know. I'm going to discuss this with the next topic, whether I think that was a good signing or not. Moving on to the Raiders. The Raiders brought in, and like I said, I will preface this once again by saying I'm not focusing on everyone. I know they brought in Jimmy Garoppolo. I'm not going to focus on that today because I focused on that last week. The Raiders brought in Jacoby Myers, which is a big signing, and Brandon Facyson. Jacoby Myers plays receiver, and that is going to be a position in need for them opposite Davante Adams. They also have Philip Dorsett that they brought in, who's a receiver. Brandon Facyson is a cornerback, will provide some depth. It'll be interesting to see what they decide to do in the first round this year. They also signed safety Marcus Epps, who I really believe is going to be a good safety, and I'm bummed the Eagles couldn't keep him. Moving on to the final team that I'm going to discuss, and of course I've gone through all 32 teams, so I appreciate your guys' patience. Hopefully you guys have learned some stuff, but the Chargers have signed linebacker Eric Kendricks. That's probably one of the biggest signings that they made. Eric Kendricks is going to be a really good linebacker for this team. The question is this going to be a division-winning type of signing? My guess would be no. And so, with that being said, I'm going to move on to the final topic of today, topic number 5, winners and losers in free agency. So I'm going to start with the winners. I've got 2 teams here, and then I'm going to highlight the losers. So for the winners, I've got the Chicago Bears. I really think that the trade with the Panthers gave them an enormous amount of picks that they can use for the future to surround Justin Fields. I think I discussed in the Out of Pocket podcast with Michael Davis, he gave a bold take that they still have the ability to go out and trade 2 first-round picks for because they have 3 first-round picks now. So they have an ability to trade 2 first-round picks for Lamar Jackson, and they have the cap space. I still think that's a real possibility. He brought that up. I haven't focused on that enough. Lamar Jackson could go for 2 first-round picks. Does Chicago want to go and get him? There's a real possibility. They wouldn't even set their team back. They would literally get 2 first-round picks and Justin Fields. Honestly, if I were the Ravens, I would accept that. So, moving on, they also signed Tremaine Edmonds and linebackers Tremaine Edmonds and T.J. Edwards. They also signed, like I said earlier in the show, Robert Tonyan and Devontae Foreman. They also got DJ Moore from the trade with the Panthers. This is a team that is on the up and up, and I'm going to tell you right now, I think they're going to be a top 2 team in the NFC North. I think it's going to be them and the Lions that are going to compete for the first position in the NFC North. That's a bold take because I know the Vikings, are probably going to be favorites still, but that's my opinion. Moving on to the second winner, Carolina Panthers. This is really odd because you would think, one person's a winner, one person's a loser. I think it's quite the opposite. The Carolina Panthers have done a lot in free agency. They made good pickups they made good signings in coaching staff, and they made good signings in free agency. I think Hayden Hurst is an incredibly underrated tight end, as well as Miles Sanders. While they did pay him some money, he will be a very good running back in that system, and he's going to be very helpful for a rookie quarterback, which they are now drafting 100% with the number 1 pick. Now, here's the deal. I've been giving this some thought over the last 2 weeks, well, really the last 10 days. The Carolina Panthers, there is a path for them to seriously decide, hey, we're going to smoke screen. We want C.J. Stroud. We know that the Houston Texans want Bryce Young. This is a scenario here. They could trade with the Houston Texans and potentially get one of those first-round picks back. They could trade with the Colts get the third quarterback that is pretty much guaranteed to be either C.J. Stroud, Bryce Young, or Anthony Richardson. I would say right now Richardson. Get Richardson and potentially get all of those picks back. So that's a brilliant move in my opinion, because I don't know if there is a big difference between any of those three quarterbacks. And that could be a really good move. It remains to be seen. But ultimately, the ball is in their court, and teams are going to come calling if they've not already done so. Moving on to the losers in free agency and the last subtopic of this podcast, the Baltimore Ravens. The Lamar Jackson saga, in my opinion, has basically completely handicapped this team's ability to do anything. They're right now on the limbo where they don't know whether they can pay Lamar Jackson, because they already apparently, there was big rumors on whether or not he was actually offered the contract. The reports were saying he was offered. Some people say it was a disrespectful amount of money, how little they offered him. The bottom line is, this doesn't bode well for a team who missed the playoffs. They missed it last year, and it appears that they're probably going to miss it this year again, unless they can figure out a way to sign him and bring some players in, which, you could argue that a lot of the top name players are already gone in free agency. Like, what is this team doing? Now, if they get 2 first-round picks and they trade him, all of a sudden this team looks like not a rebuilding team. They've got some players that they can work with, but there is so much room for improvement. And I would say this right now. Justin Fields, in my opinion, is a big drop-off from Lamar Jackson. Doesn't mean he can't become that type of a player. You get 2 first-round picks in a Justin Fields, and I know this is not probably an original take. I know for a fact this is not an original take because we discussed this in the show that I was on Friday. But that's really not a bad move if you're the Ravens. So, moving on to team number 2, the Green Bay Packers. I mean, this is pretty much a similar situation. You've got a quarterback who potentially really wants to play for a different team. The Green Bay Packers are handicapped by the Rodgers situation, and they've not really signed anyone major in free agency. If anything, they've lost their number 1 receiver now in Adam Lazard. They're also rolling with a quarterback who is a rookie, essentially. He's not a rookie QB, but he's a rookie in the terms of he's not played hardly any games in Jordan Love, and they're rolling with him now. I don't think this is going to change in the coming months. I think this is the guy they're going to roll with, but this really could end up netting them with a top 10 pick next year. I'm not saying I doubt Jordan Love. I just doubt the talent on their team. And you lose Lazard, you lose Robert Tonyan, you bring back Aaron Jones on a restructured contract. I mean, is your running back the only guy on your team that's talented on the offensive side of the ball? I hate to say it. You've got Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs. Both of those receivers are good, but there's a lot to be said about potentially the lack on the Green Bay Packers side. Now, if the Jets give up a first-round pick and some players, or a player, ultimately the Green Bay Packers all of a sudden maybe are able to help their quarterback out, but it remains to be seen. And right now I would say they are a loser this far into the free agency period. Moving on, the Kansas City Chiefs. The signing of Jawaan Taylor, I would say, was a little bit odd. I started looking at the contract, and I was reading an article that was sort of analyzing it. They ended up paying Jawaan Taylor, who is a right tackle, more money than Orlando Brown's contract with the Cincinnati Bengals, and they're now switching him over to left tackle, which it can be done, but that's a really odd signing. I'm not saying that's a loser of a signing, but it remains to be seen whether that is going to affect the team down the road. Moving forward, just some very quick questions. Did the Eagles overcommit on defensive back, and does that make them a loser in free agency? I would say right now, no. They kept together the core of players. Safety, in my opinion, is a easier position to replace, even though Chauncey Gardner-Johnson was incredibly difficult. I would say it remains to be seen, but right now, no. Did Dallas do enough with the Cooks trade? Well, the truth is, Colin Cowherd, and I can't stand the guy sometimes, but he made a comment on his show today or yesterday that ultimately, if CeeDee Lamb tweaks his ankle, is Brandon Cooks now your wide receiver 1? That's a concern. So I would say the 49ers, the Cowboys definitely need to focus on getting another receiver. He's a great wide receiver 2, but he's not capable, in my opinion, of being a wide receiver 1 due to his injury history as well. So it remains to be seen whether that's going to pan out. A lot of question marks in the NFC East as far as how these signings or trades are going to pan out. Did the Giants overcommit with the Waller trade? I would say yes and no. Waller has battled injuries. He's going to become hopefully a safety, if you're a Giants fan, hopefully a safety blanket for Daniel Jones. But I don't think this fixes the issue that they don't have a star player on the receiving end of the football. They've got a bunch of maybe semi-good players, but is this Waller for a third-round pick? Maybe. Debatable. Remains to be seen, like I said. Finally, who does Washington actually really want at quarterback? Because the truth is, they bring in Jacoby Brissett. And I will say this. He is capable of leading a team to win. But the thing with the Commanders is they find themselves in this awkward position that they're probably too high up in the draft. Too far back in the draft to draft a quarterback. So unless they make a play for a quarterback and mortgage their future, which I don't believe the Snyder-run organization will do because it's about the worst organization on the planet. But the real question is, where are the Commanders going? I could see a real scenario where Will Levis slips out of the top 10, potentially top 15. But there's also a scenario where he goes in the top 9. And if that scenario comes true, are the Commanders willing to trade into the top 10 picks to get a player like Will Levis? Because presumably with the top 4 picks, 3 quarterbacks are going. And I think right now that's going to be Richardson, Bryce Young, and the quarterback from Ohio State. So the real question is, how do they proceed? And that is a big question mark. So there's some big question marks all over the league, but there's a lot of question marks in the NFC East in particular. Well, guys, that is the end of this show. I appreciate you for tuning in for my longest podcast to date. It has been a joy to go through free agency. I'm going to focus on free agency moving forward pretty frequently, but not in its entirety on every episode. So next week, I'm going to focus a little bit as a sneak peek for anyone who has gotten this far in the episode. Next week, I am going to focus a little bit on the NBA. So that'll be fun. I may even in the future do a little bit of soccer news as well. So thanks again, everyone, for supporting my podcast. I am at 39 followers on Instagram, humble beginnings, but I appreciate each and every one of you guys for following me. Check me out on Twitter at the Long John Pod, on TikTok and Instagram at the Long John Podcast, and check out my YouTube channel at the Long John Podcast as well. Once again, I appreciate all of your support. Continue watching these or listening to these streams, and I hope to give you the best information as possible, and hopefully some interesting information. For now, that's it. Thank you for listening to this episode, and it's your host, Joseph Camperman from the Long John Podcast, signing off.